Berlin, February 1946. The city breathed in shallow gasps, each exhalation a cloud of frost that hung over streets lined with skeletal buildings. Winter had settled over the ruins like a cruel judge, indifferent to the suffering below. 12-year-old Leon Hartman pressed his face against the cracked window of what remained of their apartment, watching smoke rise from barrel fires where neighbors burned furniture just to survive another night. The war had ended 9 months ago, but peace felt like another word for slow dying. Where bombs had once fallen, now silence reigned, a silence broken only by the hollow coughs of the hungry and the scraping of boots through rubble. Leon's breath fogged the glass as he studied the street below, counting the people who shuffled past with empty sacks, searching for anything edible among the debris. Behind him, his 6-year-old sister Annalise lay curled beneath every blanket they owned, her breathing shallow and labored. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 weeks. The ration cards provided barely enough to keep a sparrow alive, and even those meager portions were becoming harder to obtain. The black market demanded prices only the desperate or wealthy could afford, and Leon's family was neither. Their mother had died 18 months earlier when an Allied bomb struck the building where she'd been sheltering. Leon remembered the silence that followed the explosion more than the noise itself, how the world seemed to pause, as if taking a breath before screaming. His father, a conscripted soldier in the final desperate months of the war, had vanished somewhere on the Eastern Front. No letter, no telegram, no body, just absence. At 12, Leon had become both brother and parent to Annalise. He'd learned to stretch a single potato across 2 days, to boil leather belts until they became something resembling soup, to smile when his stomach cramped so badly he could barely stand. But no amount of resourcefulness could conjure food from empty air. The apartment they occupied, 3 rooms in a building missing its entire western wall, belonged to a widow named Frau Mueller who lived on the floor below. She'd taken them in out of pity, asking nothing in return except that Leon help clear rubble from the courtyard when he had strength. Most days he had none. Leon turned from the window and knelt beside his sister's mattress. Annalise's face had taken on a waxy quality that terrified him. Her cheekbones protruded sharply, and her eyes, when open, held a dullness that reminded him of the dying soldiers he'd seen in the final days of the war. "Leon?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here, Anna. Is it breakfast time?" He swallowed hard. Breakfast would be a slice of bread so thin you could see through it, divided between them. "Soon. Rest a little more." She nodded, her eyelids fluttering closed. Leon watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets, counting each breath like a miser counting coins. How many breaths did a person have left when they looked like this? How long before his sister became another statistic in a city drowning in death? He stood abruptly, unable to bear the waiting any longer. Something had to change. Someone had to act. The Americans had arrived in their sector of Berlin with convoys of trucks that seemed to never stop coming. Leon had watched from a safe distance as soldiers unloaded crate after crate of supplies into their compound, a former German administrative building that had survived the bombing relatively intact. The transformation had been swift. Barbed wire, guard posts, floodlights, and signs in English warning civilians to keep their distance. But with the Americans came rumors that spread through the starving city like wildfire. They had real coffee, fresh bread, chocolate bars wrapped in shiny paper, canned meat that didn't require ration cards, medicine that actually worked. To the desperate people of Berlin, the American compound might as well have been paradise behind barbed wire. She nodded, her eyelids fluttering closed. Leon watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets, counting each breath like a miser counting coins. How many breaths did a person have left when they looked like this? How long before his sister became another statistic in a city drowning in death? He stood abruptly, unable to bear the waiting any longer. Something had to change. Someone had to act. Leon first heard the details from Hans, a 13-year-old who'd lost his entire family in the bombing. Hans lived in the rubble of what had once been an apartment complex, surviving by his wits and quick hands. They'd met while searching through a collapsed bakery, both hoping to find overlooked grain in the ruins. "The guards would shoot you before you got close," Leon had replied, though his heart had quickened at the possibility. Leon had walked away from that conversation, determined to forget it. Stealing from the occupying forces could mean imprisonment, or worse. But that was before Annalise had stopped eating entirely. Before her lips had begun to crack from dehydration. Before Leon had caught himself calculating how long it might take for her to die. He began watching the compound. At first, he told himself he was just curious, that knowing the guards' patterns was merely information, not intention. He memorized the shift changes, noted when the lights dimmed in certain sections, observed which soldiers smoked cigarettes during their rounds and which ones stayed alert. The drainage pipe Hans had mentioned ran beneath the eastern fence, partially hidden by debris that the Americans hadn't bothered to clear. Leon confirmed its existence during a careful reconnaissance, approaching as if merely passing by, just another hungry child in a city full of them. Other children tried more direct approaches. Leon watched from across the street as a girl no older than 8 approached the main gate, her hand outstretched, begging for food. The American guard, a young man with red hair, looked uncomfortable but shook his head, gesturing for her to leave. When she persisted, a military policeman emerged and shooed her away more forcefully, though without violence. "The rules are clear," Leon overheard an older German man explaining to a cluster of desperate mothers. "They're not allowed to give us anything directly. It all goes through official channels, the relief organizations, the ration offices. The soldiers could be disciplined for breaking protocol, but protocol didn't feed Annalise. Official channels moved at the speed of bureaucracy while children starved in real time." Leon made his decision on a Thursday evening, after Annalise had been too weak to even sit up. He would go that night, during the gap between the midnight and 2 o'clock patrol changes, when he'd noticed the guards grew most lax, their attention dulled by cold and fatigue. He told Frau Mueller he was going to search for firewood, a believable excuse in the dead of winter. She nodded without really seeing him, her own grief and exhaustion making her incurious about the comings and goings of others. The city at midnight felt like a massive tomb. Leon moved through streets, lit only by moonlight reflecting off snow, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. He dressed in his darkest clothes, a threadbare coat that had belonged to his father, pants torn at both knees, boots held together with wire and desperation. The American compound loomed ahead, its perimeter lights creating pools of harsh illumination that made the darkness between them seem even deeper. Leon's heart hammered so violently he was certain the guards would hear it. He circled around to the eastern side, keeping to the shadows, moving with the careful silence his father had once taught him while hunting in the woods outside the city. That seemed like a different lifetime now. A different world. The drainage pipe gaped open exactly where Hans had described a dark mouth leading under the fence. Leon checked his watch, a precious item he'd managed to keep hidden through all the chaos. 11:47. The next patrol would pass in 3 minutes, then he'd have a 20-minute window. He crouched behind a pile of rubble, forcing himself to breathe slowly despite his racing pulse. A guard appeared, walking the perimeter with practiced boredom, the glow of a cigarette marking his progress. The soldier passed without pausing, his boots crunching through frozen snow. Leon counted to 60, then moved. The pipe was smaller than he'd hoped, the metal edges sharp with rust. He scraped his shoulders, squeezing through, biting his lip to keep from crying out when something tore his coat. Then he was inside the compound, crouched in shadow, listening for any sign of alarm. Nothing. Just the distant hum of generators and the muffled sounds of music from somewhere inside the main building. The supply building Hans had described stood about 50 meters away, a squat concrete structure with a simple padlock on the door. But beside it, Leon spotted something even better. Wooden crates stacked under a canvas tarp, probably intended for transport the next morning. He moved toward them with agonizing slowness, freezing at every sound, every shift of wind. His hands shook as he lifted the edge of the tarp and found what he'd barely dared to hope for. Ration boxes marked with English words he couldn't read, but whose contents he could smell: bread, dried meat, something sweet. Leon reached for a small box of crackers, thinking he could slip it under his coat without being noticed. His fingers had just closed around it when his boot caught on a piece of metal debris hidden beneath the snow. The crash seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, a chain reaction of noise as his stumble knocked over a shovel that hit a bucket that rolled against other equipment. Leon froze, the crackers still in his hand, his entire body rigid with terror. Shouts erupted from the guardhouse. Flashlight beams swept across the compound. Heavy boots pounded toward him. Leon ran. Not toward the drainage pipe, that exit was too far now, but toward the shadows along the building's edge, looking desperately for any place to hide. The flashlights found him within seconds, pinning him against the concrete wall like an insect under glass. "Stop right there. Hands up." The commands came in English, but the meaning was clear. Leon raised his hands, the box of crackers falling to the snow. 3 soldiers surrounded him, rifles pointed at his chest, their young faces hard with suspicion and adrenaline. The soldiers kept their weapons trained on Leon while calling for backup. More flashlights arrived, more boots, more shouting in English that Leon couldn't understand, but whose tone carried clear threat. His legs trembled so badly he thought he might collapse. One soldier, older than the others with sergeant stripes on his sleeve, barked questions at him. Leon shook his head, tears burning his eyes, and managed to whisper in German, "Please, my sister is dying. I only wanted food for her." The sergeant frowned, not comprehending. He gestured sharply for Leon to walk toward the main building. Leon stumbled forward, convinced he was about to be shot or thrown into a cell to freeze. He thought of Annalise waking to find him gone, growing weaker alone, dying without ever knowing what happened to him. "Wait." The word came from one of the younger soldiers, a private who'd been hanging back from the initial confrontation. He stepped forward into the light, a man perhaps 19 or 20, with brown hair and eyes that held something besides suspicion. "Sergeant Davis, sir." "Look at him." "I am looking at him, Carter. He's a thief. He's a kid, sir. And he's starving." Private Carter, the name was stenciled on his uniform, lowered his rifle and approached Leon slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. Up close, Leon could see the soldier was very young indeed, probably only 7 or 8 years older than himself. Carter's eyes traveled over Leon's skeletal frame, the bones visible at his wrists and collarbone, the hollow cheeks and cracked lips. Carter said something in English to the sergeant, his tone respectful but firm. An argument ensued, other soldiers chiming in. Leon stood frozen, understanding nothing except that his fate was being debated by people who'd been killing his countrymen just months ago. Finally, Sergeant Davis let out an exasperated sigh and waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. 5 minutes, Carter." Then he goes to the MP station for processing. "You want to risk your career for this? That's your choice." The sergeant and 2 other guards walked away, though they kept glancing back. Carter turned to Leon, and very slowly lowered himself to crouch so they were at eye level. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something Leon hadn't seen in over a year. A chocolate bar. The sight of it made Leon's throat close up. The wrapper gleamed under the lights, promising sweetness and calories and life. Carter unwrapped it halfway and held it out. Leon shook his head violently, certain it was a trap, a trick, a test. You didn't take food from the enemy. You didn't trust kindness from those who'd bombed your city into dust. Carter seemed to understand the refusal. He pulled out a small photograph from his breast pocket, a girl about Annalise's age, blonde and smiling in front of a White House. Carter pointed to the girl, then to his chest, then to Leon. "Sister?" he asked in heavily accented German. Leon nodded, his voice breaking. "She's dying. Please. She needs food." Carter stood and walked over to where his pack leaned against the supply building. The other remaining soldiers watched but didn't interfere. From the pack, Carter pulled out more items, a can of something with a picture of meat, a package of crackers, another chocolate bar, a small bag of hard candies. He returned and placed them in Leon's hands one by one, pressing them firmly so Leon had no choice but to hold them. Then Carter did something even more unexpected. He removed his own wool scarf and wrapped it around Leon's neck. "For your sister," he said in broken German. "Go. Quick." Leon stared at the items in his arms, his mind unable to process what was happening. Enemies didn't do this. Conquerors didn't share their rations with the conquered. This violated everything he understood about the world, about war, about the natural order of victor and vanquished. Another soldier, a corporal named Williams, walked over and added a canteen of water and a small jar of peanut butter to the pile. "Kid looks like a ghost," he muttered to Carter. "How old you think? 12? 13? Same age as my brother back home," Carter replied softly. A third soldier, Private Lopez, contributed a package of dried fruit and a tin of condensed milk. "Tell him to give the milk to the little one. Mix it with water, it'll help." Leon's eyes burned. His throat closed completely. The weight of what they were giving him, not just the physical weight, but the weight of the choice they were making, pressed down on him like an avalanche. These were the men who'd bombed his city, killed his mother, whose armies had destroyed everything he'd known. And they were saving his sister's life. Carter helped Leon arrange everything inside his coat, buttoning it carefully to keep the items secure. Then he led Leon not toward the military police station, but back toward the eastern fence. The other soldiers followed, forming a kind of protective escort. At the drainage pipe, Carter crouched down one more time. He pulled out a stub of pencil and a piece of paper, drew a simple map showing how to find the compound's back gate, and pointed to a mark he'd made. "Tomorrow, 1600, 4 o'clock. Bring your sister. We help." Leon clutched the paper, the food, the scarf, clutched these impossible gifts from impossible people. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, streaming down his face as sobs racked his malnourished frame. He cried for his mother, for his missing father, for Annalise and her hollow eyes, for the city and its ruins, for the whole broken world. And he cried because 3 soldiers who should have been his enemies had chosen to be human instead. Carter placed a hand on Leon's shoulder, just resting it there until the sobs subsided. Then he gently pushed Leon toward the drainage pipe. "Go," before the sergeant changes his mind. Leon squeezed back through the gap, emerged on the other side of the fence, and ran. He ran through the frozen streets with his coat bulging with treasures, ran past the rubble and the barrel fires, ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. He ran toward home, toward Annalise, toward life. Leon burst through the apartment door at nearly 1 in the morning, startling Frau Muller, who'd been dozing in her chair. He didn't pause to explain, just rushed to Annalise's side and began unpacking the miraculous haul from his coat. Annalise stirred at the commotion, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw what Leon was laying out on the blanket, food, real food, more food than they'd seen in months, her expression didn't change. She'd become too weak for excitement, too depleted for anything but a kind of distant acknowledgement. "Anna," Leon whispered, unwrapping the chocolate bar with shaking hands. "Look, it's real." He broke off a small piece and held it to her lips. She took it into her mouth slowly, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then her eyes widened, the first real emotion Leon had seen in them for weeks. She chewed carefully, tears forming as the sweetness flooded her senses. "It tastes like..." She paused, searching for a memory, almost lost. "Like Christmas. Like before." Leon laughed and cried at the same time, feeding her another small piece. He knew she couldn't eat too much at once. The shock to her system could be dangerous, but even these few bites felt like a resurrection. Color seemed to return to her cheeks almost immediately, though Leon knew that was probably just his imagination. Just desperate hope painting reality in brighter shades. Frau Muller approached, her lined face slack with astonishment. "Leon, where did you get all this? What have you done?" He told her everything: the compound, the theft attempt, the soldiers who'd chosen mercy over duty. As he spoke, Frau Muller's expression cycled through disbelief, fear, and finally, something like wonder. "Americans," she whispered, touching the can of meat as if it might vanish. "Americans gave you this." Soldiers, Leon corrected. Young men who remembered they were human. Word spread through the building despite the late hour. Neighbors who'd been awakened by Leon's return gathered in the hallway, drawn by impossible rumors of food. Leon found himself sharing small portions of cracker here, a candy there, unable to keep such wealth to himself when surrounded by equal desperation. An elderly man named Herr Schmidt, who'd lost 3 sons in the war, held a piece of chocolate in his weathered hand and wept openly. "I spent 4 years hating them," he said, quietly. 4 years blaming them for everything. And now, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That night, Annalise slept more soundly than she had in weeks, her stomach no longer completely empty, her body given the smallest chance to begin healing. Leon sat beside her mattress, Carter's wool scarf still wrapped around his neck, and tried to understand what had happened. The world was supposed to work a certain way. Enemies remained enemies. Victors took, they didn't give. Soldiers followed orders, they didn't make exceptions for starving children. Everything Leon had learned about life, about war, about the rigid categories that separated us from them. He had been challenged by 3 American privates who'd simply chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. As dawn broke over Berlin's ruins, turning the snow-covered rubble golden and pink, Leon made a decision. He would take Carter up on his offer. He would bring Annalise to the back gate at 4 o'clock. Not because he trusted all Americans, or because one act of mercy erased the bombs and the deaths and the destruction, but because his sister was alive this morning when she shouldn't be. And that was a miracle he couldn't afford to refuse. The back gate that Carter had marked on his crude map turned out to be a service entrance used for deliveries, less formal than the main checkpoint. Leon approached at precisely 4 o'clock, holding Annalise's hand, both of them scrubbed as clean as possible with the limited water they had. Carter was there, along with Williams and Lopez. They weren't in formation or on official duty. This was clearly something they were doing on their own time. When Carter saw them, his face split into a genuine smile. "You came," he said in his broken German, then switched to English to speak with his companions. Williams fetched a wooden crate for Annalise to sit on while Lopez disappeared into the compound, returning minutes later with a medical kit. What followed was a careful examination of Annalise by Lopez, who turned out to have worked in his father's clinic back in Texas. He checked her eyes, her pulse, listened to her breathing. His expression grew serious as he conferred with Carter in low English. Carter knelt beside Leon. "She needs more than food. She needs medicine, vitamins." He struggled for the German words, finally resorting to drawing pictures, pills, vegetables, milk. "Every day you come. We help. But secret? Yes. Our sergeant. He's good man. But rules are rules." Over the next 3 weeks, Leon and Annalise made daily pilgrimages to the back gate. Each time, the 3 soldiers had something for them: surplus rations, vitamin tablets acquired from the medical supplies, once even a small bottle of milk that Lopez had somehow obtained from the officer's mess. But it became more than just a transaction. Carter began teaching Leon English words, pointing to objects and pronouncing them carefully. Williams showed Annalise magic tricks with coins, making her laugh for the first time since their mother's death. Lopez told stories about Texas, painting word pictures of a place with blue skies and no rubble, where children played instead of scrounged. Leon found himself looking forward to these visits, not just for the food, but for the connection. These men asked about his day, remembered details from previous conversations, treated him like a person rather than a problem or a victim. In their company, he felt less like a survivor and more like a boy again. Other soldiers began to notice. Carter's bunkmate, a corporal from Ohio named Jensen, started contributing to the supplies. A sergeant from another unit, whose own daughter was Annalise's age, quietly ignored what was happening. It spread not officially, not openly, but like a gentle conspiracy of decency. Annalise gained weight. The hollow look left her eyes. She started asking questions again, curious about the world beyond their ruined apartment. The condensed milk and vitamin tablets were working miracles that Leon had thought impossible. One afternoon, as Leon helped Carter practice his German pronunciation, Williams approached, looking troubled. "Carter, we might have a problem." Captain Morrison was asking questions about missing supplies, not accusing anybody yet, but the three soldiers exchanged worried glances. Leon's stomach tightened. He understood enough English now to catch the meaning. "You're in trouble? Because of us?" Carter shrugged, trying to look unconcerned. "Don't worry about it, kid. We're careful. It'll be fine." But Leon could see it wasn't fine. These men were risking their careers, possibly their freedom, to feed 2 German children. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. The crisis came on a cold morning in early March. Leon and Annalise arrived at the back gate to find it locked. No soldiers in sight. Leon's heart sank. He tried to peer through the fence, searching for any sign of Carter or the others. A different soldier appeared, older, with hard eyes and captain's bars on his collar. He looked at the children without sympathy. "You two need to leave. Civilians aren't permitted near military installations. Go on. Get out of here." But Private Carter Leon began. "Private Carter is currently under investigation for theft of military property. If you're smart, you'll forget you ever knew him." The captain's voice was ice. "Now move along before I call the military police." Leon led Annalise away, his mind reeling. Under investigation for theft. Because he'd fed starving children. The injustice of it burned in his chest. But what could he do? He was just a German boy, one of millions of defeated people, with no power, no voice, no standing to advocate for anything. Annalise gained weight. The hollow look left her eyes. She started asking questions again, curious about the world beyond their ruined apartment. The condensed milk and vitamin tablets were working miracles that Leon had thought impossible. They returned to their apartment in silence. Frau Muller took one look at their faces and knew something had gone terribly wrong. "The soldiers?" she asked gently. That evening, Herr Schmidt knocked on their door. "I heard what happened," he said. "About the American soldiers getting in trouble." "There's nothing we can do," Leon replied bitterly. "We're nobody, maybe." The old man's eyes held a calculating look. "But I know someone who works at the British Sector Liaison Office. His job is to coordinate between the occupation forces and civilian administration. Perhaps it was a long shot, but it was something." Leon spent the next day composing a letter in careful German, explaining what Carter, Williams, and Lopez had done, how they'd saved Annalise's life, how their actions had restored a small measure of faith in human decency. He didn't expect it to make a difference what was one letter against military regulations. But he had to try. Meanwhile, inside the American compound, Carter sat in a bare interrogation room across from Captain Morrison and Sergeant Davis. The captain laid out evidence in neat rows, discrepancy reports, inventory shortages, witness statements placing Carter near the supply building at irregular hours. "You want to explain this, Private?" Morrison's voice could have frozen water. Carter met his eyes steadily. "I gave food to starving children, sir. German children who were dying. You violated standing orders. You stole military property. You compromised security by making unauthorized contact with civilians." Morrison ticked off the charges on his fingers. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that you could face court-martial? Dishonorable discharge?" "Yes, sir." "Then why? Why risk everything for a couple of German kids? Their people killed Americans. They're the enemy." Carter was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "With respect, sir, the war's over. Those kids never killed anybody. They're just hungry. And I didn't join the army to watch children starve when I had the power to help them." Sergeant Davis, who'd been silent until now, shifted in his seat. "Captain, if I may, Carter's not the only one. Half the men in this company have been sharing rations with the locals. It's not organized, it's not official, but it's happening. You court-martial Carter, you'll have to court-martial 50 others." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Are you telling me there's a systemic breakdown in discipline under my command?" I'm telling you there's a systematic outbreak of compassion, sir. Davis's voice was careful but firm. These boys saw hell in combat. Now they're seeing hell in peacetime, children with swollen bellies, old folks freezing in ruins. Sometimes the human response trumps the military one. That evening, as Carter sat in temporary detention awaiting Morrison's decision, something unexpected happened. A British liaison officer named Major Pembridge arrived at the compound with a letter in hand. Leon's letter, translated into English, accompanied by supporting statements from Frau Müller, Herr Schmidt, and a dozen other residents of their building. Pembridge requested a meeting with Morrison, and what transpired in that office would later become something of a legend among the occupation forces. The British major, with diplomatic immunity and a reputation for speaking his mind, delivered a quiet but devastating assessment. Captain, we're trying to win the peace here, not just administer the defeat. What your private did feeding those children, that's worth more than 100 official relief programs. That's the kind of thing that stops the next war before it starts. Morrison read the letter, his expression unreadable. It's still a violation of regulations. Regulations be damned, Pembridge replied bluntly. Excuse my language, but I've spent 18 months trying to convince these people that we're not monsters, that we're here to help rebuild, not just occupy. And you want to punish a soldier for proving exactly that? The argument that followed was reportedly intense, with Morrison defending the necessity of military discipline, and Pembridge countering that discipline without wisdom was just tyranny in uniform. Finally, the captain made his decision. Carter was released from detention that night with a formal reprimand placed in his file serious enough to look like punishment, light enough to mean nothing to his career. Williams and Lopez received written warnings, and Morrison issued a new standing order. Soldiers could donate to official relief organizations, but direct distribution of military supplies to civilians would go through proper channels. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which meant it was probably fair. The next afternoon, Carter found himself assigned to escort duty for a Red Cross distribution at a civilian relief center technically within regulations, but obviously arranged so he could see the children he'd been helping. Leon and Annalise were there, and when Carter entered in full uniform, Annalise broke into a run and hugged his legs. "You're okay," she said in careful English, one of the phrases she'd learned from him. "We worried." Carter knelt down, his eyes bright with emotion. "I'm okay, and you're okay. That's what matters." Leon stood apart, struggling with words. Finally, he said in halting English, "You could have." He didn't know the word for denied. "You could have said, you not help us. Could have saved yourself." "No," Carter replied. "I couldn't have. Some things matter more than being safe." That evening, back at the compound, Carter and his friends pooled their resources one final time. They filled a canvas bag with rations, medicines, and supplies, everything legitimately available through official channels now, but also including personal items, William's spare gloves, Lopez's extra blanket, Carter's warmest socks. They brought it to the back gate where Sergeant Davis was waiting, having arranged to be on duty specifically for this handoff. The sergeant's face was expressionless as he accepted the bag, but his voice was gentle. "This is the last time, son. New orders. You understand?" "Yes, Sergeant, but—" Davis paused, then continued quietly. "The chaplain's organizing a proper relief program. He'll need volunteers to help distribute supplies." "You interested?" Carter smiled. "Yes, Sergeant, very interested." When Leon and Annalise received the final bag through official channels, they found something extra inside a photograph of Carter, Williams, and Lopez, posed together in front of the compound. On the back, Carter had written in careful German, "For Leon and Annalise, friends are forever. M.C." 17 years passed. Berlin rebuilt itself stone by stone, rising from ruins into a modern city divided by politics, but united in its determination to survive. The American compound was long gone, replaced by apartment buildings and shops. The drainage pipe where Leon had squeezed through that desperate night had been filled in and paved over. The war became history, then memory, then something younger people learned about in schools. Leon Hartmann, now 29, stood at the front of a classroom in West Berlin's Friedrich Ebert Gymnasium, teaching history to students who'd been born after the war ended. He'd earned his degree through evening classes while working construction during the day, driven by a desire to understand how the world had broken so catastrophically and how it might be prevented from breaking again. Annalise, 23, worked as a nurse at the University Medical Center, specializing in pediatric care. She was particularly patient with children who'd experienced trauma, who couldn't articulate their fears, who needed someone to see them, as Carter had once seen her as worthy of saving despite the circumstances of their birth. They lived in the same apartment building where they'd spent those terrible months after the war, though it had been completely renovated. Frau Müller had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving them the apartment in her will. Herr Schmidt still lived downstairs, now 82, still sharp-minded and opinionated. On a Tuesday evening in April 1963, Leon returned home to find a letter waiting postmarked from Minnesota, United States. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter was from Carter. He'd been searching for them for years, working through Red Cross databases and military records, trying to reconnect with the children he'd helped in Berlin. He'd gotten married, had 3 kids of his own now, worked as a teacher like Leon. Williams had become a lawyer in Chicago. Lopez ran a clinic in his Texas hometown. "I think about you both often," Carter had written. "Those weeks in Berlin changed me. Changed how I see the world. How I understand what matters. I tell my students about it sometimes, about 2 brave kids and how they taught me that kindness doesn't need permission. It just needs courage." Enclosed in the envelope was a photograph. Carter with his wife and children. Williams with his family. Lopez in front of his clinic. On the back, Carter had written, "Our families. Built on the foundation of hope you two helped me remember." Leon sat down at his small desk and began to write his response. But the words felt inadequate, too small to contain what he needed to say. How do you thank someone for not just saving your life, but for saving your faith in humanity? How do you express gratitude for a gift whose value only increased with time? Finally, he simply wrote the truth. "Dear Michael, you saw us. In the middle of hatred and division, you looked at 2 German children and saw human beings worth saving. That wasn't just charity, it was an act of radical hope. You proved that even in our darkest moments, we can choose connection over separation, compassion over vengeance. Annalise and I teach your lesson every day, she in her hospital, I in my classroom. We tell your story carefully, preserving its details, because it contains something the world desperately needs. Evidence that enemies are only enemies until someone decides to be human instead. You probably saved my sister's life that winter, but you did something more important. You saved the idea that people can be better than their circumstances, kinder than their histories, braver than their orders. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you anyway, for everything." Leon finished the letter at midnight, then walked to Annalise's apartment to show her. They looked at Carter's photograph together, marveling at how young he'd been in 1946, how much life had happened in the years between. "Do you remember the chocolate?" Annalise asked quietly. "Every detail. It didn't just taste sweet. It tasted like the world might be okay after all." Leon nodded. That was it exactly. In the depths of winter, in a defeated city, surrounded by death and destruction, 3 soldiers had given them more than food. They'd given them proof that humanity could survive even the worst humanity did to itself. He sent the letter the next morning. Carter's response arrived 3 weeks later, and it began a correspondence that would last for decades, bridging continents and languages, connecting families who'd been born enemies, and became proof that such categories were always lies. Years later, when Leon sat down to write his memoir, eventually published as The Weight of a Chocolate Bar, he would end it with the same thought that had sustained him through all the difficult years. The soldiers who gave me food that night were not acting under orders. They were not following policy or pursuing strategy. They were simply young men who decided that the child in front of them mattered more than the uniform he wasn't wearing. That decision to see humanity in the enemy, to act with kindness when hatred would be easier, is the only thing that has ever saved us from ourselves. War taught me what we can do to each other, but Michael Carter taught me what we can do for each other, and of the two lessons, his has proven infinitely more valuable. The book sold modestly in Germany, better in the United States, but its impact was measured not in copies sold, but in the letters Leon received from veterans who remembered their own acts of mercy, from children of former enemies who'd found connection instead of continuing conflict, from teachers who used his story to show students that choosing humanity is always possible, even when everything encourages us to choose otherwise. On Leon's desk, beside his typewriter and lesson plans, stood a framed photograph. 3 American soldiers, young and smiling, standing in front of a military compound in winter. Beside it sat a carefully preserved chocolate bar wrapper, its paper yellowed with age but its message unchanged. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest weight, and every time Leon looked at it, he remembered. Kindness doesn't need permission. It just needs courage. And courage, he'd learned, is contagious.